She walked out of a billionaire's marriage interview after 10 minutes, and it was the single decision that changed the rest of her life, though she would not understand that until his family came running after her into the street. The elevator doors opened onto the 42nd floor, and 6 women stepped out ahead of her, arranged in soft pastel silk, like flowers set out for judging. Nadia Abrams walked back into the elevator. She pressed the button for the lobby, folded her arms, and watched the doors slide shut on a hallway she had already seen enough of. 10 seconds had been more than sufficient. White orchids in identical vases, spaced exactly 3 feet apart down the corridor. Women seated with rehearsed posture on chairs that had clearly been arranged for a single purpose. An assistant in a slate gray suit, holding a clipboard, speaking in the low, managed voice of someone running a schedule rather than hosting a meeting. This was not a business consultation. This was an audition, and nobody had told her she would be walking into one. 2 weeks earlier, her firm's senior partner had forwarded her an invitation that read, in careful corporate language, private consultation with Yun family leadership regarding a potential legal and corporate advisory engagement. Nadia was the sharpest contracts attorney in her practice group, the one people called when a deal had gone sideways and needed to be pulled back from the edge without anyone losing face. She had flown from Chicago to New York on a Tuesday morning in her best charcoal blazer, a leather portfolio under her arm, stuffed with notes and case precedent on subsidiary liability. She had not packed for an audition, and she was not going to sit through one. The elevator reached the lobby. She walked straight to the concierge desk and asked for a car. Her phone rang before it arrived. "Miss Abrams." The voice was male, smooth, faintly rushed at the edges. "My name is Kong. I am calling on behalf of the Yun family. I understand you may have left the building." "I did leave the building," she said. "I am standing outside it." A pause. "May I ask why?" "Because what is happening on the 42nd floor is not what I was told this meeting would be. I am an attorney. I came to discuss a professional engagement. If the nature of the meeting had changed, I would have appreciated knowing that before I flew here." Another pause, longer this time. "Miss Abrams, I understand your frustration completely. Would you be willing to return only for 15 minutes? I give you my word the conversation will be professional." Nadia looked at the street. A yellow cab crawled past. A cyclist cut between 2 idling SUVs with the fearless indifference of a man who had done it 10,000 times before. She thought about the flight already taken, the notes already prepared, the simple fact that she was already here, and the cost of walking away from a possible client over a single badly organized afternoon. 15 minutes, she said, "and if it is not what you described, I will leave again." "Understood," Kong said. "Thank you." She went back inside. He was waiting for her when the elevator doors opened again, and she understood immediately that the day had turned into something else entirely. The hallway had been cleared, the pastel-clad women were gone, the chairs removed, the orchids left standing alone like the last props of a set that had already been struck. Only one door at the far end of the corridor stood open. The man near it was tall for a Korean man, broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-30s, dressed with the understated precision of someone who had never in his life bought a suit off a rack. He had the particular stillness of a person trained from childhood not to show what he was feeling, and the faint failure of that training showed at the corners of his eyes the moment he saw her walking toward him. "Miss Abrams," he said, "I am Woo-suk. I apologize for the confusion about today." She studied him for a moment, then glanced at the open door behind him, then back. "You are the meeting," she said. It was not a question. He did not flinch from it. "In part. The other part is that my parents would like to speak with you." "Your parents?" "Yes. Not about legal matters." "No," he agreed. She could still leave. The car was likely still at the curb. She could be at the airport within the hour and back in Chicago by dinner, with a strange story to tell her sister on the phone. Instead, she said, "Lead the way," and walked through the open door into a beautifully appointed sitting room where an elderly Korean couple sat together on a low sofa, waiting for her the way people wait for a verdict they are not certain of. The man was in his mid-70s, upright and precise in the manner of someone who has held real authority for decades and never once had to raise his voice to keep it. The woman beside him had silver hair swept back from a face that missed nothing. They were Deoksu and Myungja Yoon, founders of Yoon Global, a company whose last public valuation had put it somewhere north of $3 billion. They looked at Nadia the way people look at something they had not entirely expected to find. She looked back at them the same way. "Please sit," Myungja said. Her English was careful and exact, each word placed with intention. "Thank you for coming back. I almost did not," Nadia said. And Saturday Deoksu made a sound that might have been a laugh and leaned slightly toward his wife. Something passed between them that Nadia could not fully read. Woosuk had taken a chair set slightly apart from his parents, hands resting on his knees, his face carefully neutral, watching Nadia in the manner of a man trying to understand something that had not yet finished revealing itself. "We will be direct," Deoksu said. "Our son is 36. He runs the American division of our company. He is a good man. He works too hard. He has not found a partner. We arranged today's introductions because we are old enough to understand that certain things do not happen by accident, and we wish to help this one along." "I understand that," Nadia said. "What I do not understand is why my name was on the list." A small silence. Myungja folded her hands together in her lap. "Your senior partner spoke very highly of you. We asked him who, in his entire professional circle, he genuinely admired. He gave us your name." Nadia filed that fact away under a conversation she intended to have with her senior partner at considerable length. "I am an attorney," she said. "I did not come here looking for a husband." "We know," Myungja said. "Then, I am not sure what we are doing in this room." Woosuk spoke for the first time since they had sat down. "Neither am I, honestly." He said it quietly, without drama, looking at a point somewhere between the coffee table and the floor. "I did not design today. I was asked to participate and I agreed, out of respect for my parents. But I was not comfortable with it before it started, and I am less comfortable with it now." He lifted his eyes and found hers. "I think you should know that." His mother looked at him. His father looked at him. Nadia looked at him. Whatever she had expected the son of a Korean billionaire to be in this room, it was not a man volunteering his own discomfort to the stranger seated across from him. She turned back to his parents. "I appreciate your honesty," she said, "and I appreciate that you come from a tradition where this process is meaningful and respectful. I do not dismiss that. But I am not able to participate in a selection process. That is not about pride. It is about how I am built." "We know," Myungja said again, and this time she smiled, a slow, warm expression that remade her whole face. "We know, because every other woman on that list sat in this room and told us exactly what she thought we wanted to hear. You left the building." She paused. "That is the first interesting thing that has happened all day." The room went quiet. Deoksu leaned forward. "We are not asking you to choose our son today, Miss Abrams. We are asking whether you would be willing to have dinner with our family. Simply that. Not an audition, not a selection. A dinner." Nadia looked at him, then at Myungja, then briefly at Woosuk, whose expression she could not entirely decode, something that resembled gratitude tangled up with something else she did not have a name for yet. "One dinner," she said. "One dinner," Deoksu confirmed. She looked down at the portfolio still resting in her lap, full of notes and case precedent that no one in this room had asked to see. "I still expect a professional consultation at some point," she said. "I did not fly here for nothing." Deoksu laughed outright this time. "Monday morning, 9 o'clock. I will have our legal team ready." She nodded once. Then, "Yes, one dinner." She left the building 20 minutes later with a dinner reservation for Friday and the distinct, unsettling feeling that something in her life had just shifted in a direction she had never planned for. She stood on the sidewalk in the New York afternoon and called her sister. "You will not believe this day," she said when Rochelle picked up. "Try me," Rochelle said. Nadia told her everything: the orchids, the pastel dresses, the elevator, the man waiting in the cleared hallway, the parents on the sofa, the dinner she had somehow agreed to. By the time she finished, Rochelle had gone silent for 3 full seconds, which for Rochelle was an eternity. "Back up," she said. "The son, Woosuk. Describe him. That is not the point of the story. It is absolutely the point of the story. Describe him." Nadia looked up at the building, 42 stories of glass, holding the last of the afternoon light. Tall, quiet. He told me he was uncomfortable with the whole process before anyone asked him to. He volunteered that, yes, to me, a stranger. A pause. And then Rochelle said, with the flat certainty of a woman who had spent 30 years reading her sister better than anyone alive, "That man is not uncomfortable. That man is interested and trying to be honorable about it. You are reading too much into it. I am reading exactly the right amount into it." "Are you going to the dinner?" I said I would. "Good. Wear the burgundy dress." "This is not the burgundy dress kind of dinner, Rochelle. Every dinner is the burgundy dress kind of dinner if you let it be." The dinner was held at the Yun family's private residence on the Upper East Side, a townhouse that managed to be enormous and quietly understated at the same time. The kind of building that did not need to announce what it was worth, because everyone walking past it already knew. 6 people sat at the table that evening, Deoksu and Myungja at either end. Woo-suk's older sister Subin, a surgeon with the brisk, focused energy of someone who had spent her whole life being the smartest person in most rooms and had made a permanent peace with that fact. Subin's husband, a quiet American man named Patrick, who said very little and listened a great deal and seemed genuinely, uncomplicatedly content simply to be there. And Woo-suk, across from Nadia, who had worn the burgundy dress after all. The food was extraordinary. Myungja had cooked it herself, which Nadia had not expected. A spread that moved between traditional Korean dishes and a few unmistakably Southern American touches that made Nadia look up from her plate in genuine surprise. "My mother-in-law was from Georgia," Myungja said, watching her reaction with quiet satisfaction. "I learned from her. She used to say, 'Good food is the same in every language.' She sounds like my grandmother," Nadia said. "Perhaps they would have been friends," Myungja said simply, and went back to serving. The conversation moved, the way good dinner conversation does, when the people at the table are genuinely curious about one another rather than performing curiosity for effect. Deoksu asked Nadia about her work with the precision of a man who understood contract law more deeply than most attorneys gave him credit for. Subin asked her a sharp, specific question about a recent Supreme Court decision that made Nadia sit up a little straighter. Patrick refilled her water glass every time it dipped below half and said almost nothing, and somehow made the whole table feel steadier just by being quietly present in it. Woo-suk was different here than he had been in the cleared hallway that morning, looser in his shoulders, not performing anything. He spoke easily with his parents in a way that showed a real warmth beneath the controlled exterior he wore in business settings. When his sister made a dry, surgical joke about a resident who had fainted during rounds that week, he laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and the sound of it moved through the dining room and landed somewhere in Nadia's chest before she had time to build a defense against it. She looked down at her plate and did not look up again for a moment. They spoke directly to each other perhaps 5 times over the course of the meal. Each exchange was brief and carefully managed on the surface, and, underneath the management, something else entirely was moving. The 5th time, near the end of the dinner, his parents were deep in conversation with Subin about the Seoul office, and Patrick was doing the quiet, steadying thing he did, and Woo-suk looked across the table and said, in a low voice meant only for her, "You wore a different color than I expected." She looked at him. "What did you expect? Something professional." "Navy, gray. You seemed like a navy or gray person," she said. "Monday through Thursday." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "And Friday?" "Friday I make different choices." He held her gaze a beat longer than was strictly necessary. "I will remember that," he said quietly, and she looked back at her food because her pulse was doing something she had no intention of acknowledging at a family dinner table. After the meal, while his parents and Subin settled in the sitting room with tea, Woo-suk walked her to the door. They stood a moment in the entryway, the city making its soft, distant sounds beyond the glass. "The business meeting on Monday," he said. "That is real. Our legal team has been fully briefed. You will be taken seriously. I know, she said. Your father's handshake told me that. I think your mother liked me more, though. Something close to a smile crossed his face. She did. You say that like it means something. She does not decide about people quickly. She usually takes months. He paused. She decided about you before the appetizers arrived. What does that mean to you? Nadia asked. He was quiet for a moment, honest in a way that clearly cost him something to say out loud. It means my mother saw something in you that she does not see often, and my mother has very good eyes. Nadia held his gaze, aware of something pulling between them that neither of them had named yet, and neither seemed in a hurry to. Good night, Wusuk. Good night, Nadia. She walked out into the New York evening and did not call Rochelle until she was back in her hotel room, because she needed 10 full minutes just to breathe first. When she finally called, she said, "This is a problem." "I knew it," Rochelle said immediately. "Tell me everything." The professional engagement with Yun Global turned out to be entirely real, and it was substantial. Over the following 8 weeks, Nadia flew between Chicago and New York 5 separate times. She worked with the company's legal team on 3 contract restructurings and an intellectual property dispute that had been sitting unresolved for 2 years, tangled in a jurisdictional argument that 3 previous attorneys had failed to untangle. She solved it in 11 days. Deoksu sent her a handwritten note afterward that read simply, "We should have found you sooner." She kept it in her desk drawer in Chicago and did not tell anyone that she looked at it more often than she probably should have. She and Wusuk existed in the same orbit during those 8 weeks, the way 2 people exist when they are both quietly pretending the reason they keep ending up in the same building is entirely professional, and neither one is fully convincing the other. On the second visit, he brought her coffee before a morning meeting without asking how she took it, and it was exactly right. Oat milk, 1 sugar. She looked at the cup, then at him. "Lucky guess," he said, and walked into the conference room ahead of her. She stood in the hallway a moment with the coffee warm in her hand, and a feeling she refused to name spreading slowly through her chest. On the third visit, they ended up alone in the same elevator at the end of a long Wednesday. The building was mostly empty by then, the elevator moving slowly, and for the first 2 floors, neither of them said anything. Then Wusuk said, "Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with the contract?" "You can ask. What made you choose contract law specifically?" She looked at him. "Of all the things you could ask, I am genuinely curious. You could have gone into almost anything. Litigation, corporate, criminal. You chose contracts." No one had ever asked her that before, not like that. Not with that particular quality of real interest underneath it. "Because a contract is a promise," she said, "written down with teeth. I believe people should be held to what they promise." She paused. "I grew up watching people break promises and walk away clean. I decided early that I wanted to be in the room where that was harder to do." The elevator reached the lobby. Neither of them moved right away. "That is the best answer I have ever heard to that question," he said quietly. "You have asked it before?" "Never," he said. "But if I had, it would still be the best answer." They walked out of the building together and stood on the sidewalk for a while, in the evening air, talking about things that had started nowhere near contracts and ended up somewhere far more personal. By the time her car arrived, she understood that something between them had shifted again, quietly, without announcement, the way a tide shifts. On the 4th visit, something happened that neither of them had planned. It was a Thursday. The meeting had run long. The rest of the legal team had filtered out one by one, and it was just the 2 of them left in the conference room with the city spread out behind the glass and cold takeout containers stacked at the edge of the table because no one had stopped for a proper meal. Wusuk was reading through a clause she had flagged, and she found herself watching him read it, watching the small line that appeared between his brows whenever something did not satisfy him. And she caught herself watching and looked quickly back down at her own papers. "You disagree with the indemnification structure," he said, without looking up. "I flagged it," she said. I did not say I disagreed. You flagged it with 3 question marks. He looked up. You only use 3 question marks when you think someone has made a significant error. She stared at him. You have been paying attention to my annotation style. I pay attention to everything about how you work, he said simply, not as a compliment, but as a plain fact, which somehow made it land harder than a compliment would have. She looked back at the clause. The indemnification is too broad. It exposes Yun Global unnecessarily at the subsidiary level. Show me. She moved around the table to his side and pointed to the specific language, and they stood close together over the document while she explained, and he listened and asked precise questions, and she answered them, and at no point did either of them acknowledge how close they were standing, or the fact that neither of them moved apart even after the explanation was finished. His shoulder was 2 inches from hers. Eventually she gathered her papers and stepped back to her own side of the table. I will have the revised language to you by Friday morning, she said. Thank you, he said, and his voice was slightly different than it had been a moment before, lower, more careful. She packed her portfolio, put on her coat, and was nearly at the door when he said her name, Nadia. She turned. He was still seated at the table, the document in front of him, watching her with the careful stillness she had learned to recognize as the thing he did when he was managing something large. There is something I need to tell you, he said. Tell me. My parents are expecting me to move forward with the formal marriage process, with you specifically. He held her gaze. I am not going to do that. I am going to tell them that whatever happens between us will be something we choose, not something they arrange. He paused. I wanted you to know before I spoke to them, because it involves you directly, and you deserve to know. The conference room was very still. You are asking my permission to push back against your own parents, she said. I am telling you what is happening, and how I intend to respond. What you do with that information is yours to decide. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who kept doing the honest thing when the easier thing was always sitting right there, available. Have the conversation, she said, and left. She stood alone in the elevator and pressed her palm flat against the cool metal wall and made herself breathe slowly all the way down to the lobby. The conversation Woo-suk had with his parents did not go quietly. She heard about it first from him, on a call that Saturday, when he told her simply and without drama that it had happened, that his father had initially been displeased, that it had been difficult, and that he had said what needed saying anyway. 3 days later, Myung-ja called her directly. Nadia was in her Chicago apartment, sitting on the kitchen counter with a mug of tea going cold beside her. He told us, Myung-ja said, that he will not participate in any further formal process, that if something develops between him and you, it will happen on its own terms. I see, Nadia said carefully. My husband was not immediately pleased, Myung-ja said, and there was something dry and warm underneath her voice at the same time. He came around. He usually does once he has taken enough time to think properly. A brief pause. I called because I want you to know something. The conversation my son had with us was not easy for him. Woo-suk has always found a way to honor his father while still becoming his own person. But this conversation was different. This was him drawing a line that cost him something real. Why are you telling me this? Nadia asked. Because you should know the weight of what he did, Myung-ja said. Not so you feel obligated, so you understand who you are dealing with. After the call ended, Nadia sat in her quiet kitchen for a very long time, turning over every interaction she had catalogued across the past 8 weeks. The coffee made exactly right without asking. The elevator conversation about promises with teeth. The 2 inches of space between them in the conference room that neither of them had closed and neither of them had needed to close, because it had already stopped being about distance. She picked up her phone. Your mother called me, she typed. He replied in under a minute. I should have warned you. I am sorry. Do not apologize, she wrote back. Then she told me what the conversation cost you. A longer pause this time. She should not have said that. I am glad she did. Another pause, longer than the others. Are you free Saturday? What is Saturday? I would like to take you somewhere. Not a meeting, not a family dinner. Somewhere I go when I need to think clearly, just you and me. She looked at that message for a full minute before she answered. "Yes," she finally wrote. "I am free Saturday." He took her to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. She had expected somewhere with a dress code and a reservation attached to it. Instead, he was waiting at the entrance in dark jeans and a simple jacket, no tie, 2 coffees from a place around the corner in his hands, and an expression more open than she had seen on him outside of that first cleared hallway. They walked. The morning was cool, the garden not yet crowded, and the conversation moved in a way it had never quite moved inside a conference room. He told her he had moved to New York at 28 against his father's strong preference that he remain in Seoul, and that the disagreement had been genuinely painful and taken almost 2 years to properly heal, and that he did not regret the decision even though he never once minimized what it had temporarily cost the relationship. She told him she had turned down a federal clerkship after law school because her grandmother had fallen ill, and she had stayed home to help her mother through it, and that she had never once regretted that either, though people sometimes looked at her strangely when she said so, as if they expected her to perform a grief or a loss she had genuinely never felt. "You do not seem like someone who makes decisions for other people's approval," he said. "I am not," she said. "It took me a while to get there." "How?" She thought about it honestly. "I stopped being afraid that who I actually am would be too much for someone to handle. I decided if it was too much, then it was the wrong someone. That is a good way to live. It is a lonely one sometimes," she said, because it was true, and she had decided early in this particular acquaintance that she would not be less than honest with him. He looked at her when she said it, not with pity, with recognition. "Yes," he said, "I know that specific loneliness." They walked in comfortable silence for a while. Near the Japanese garden he stopped walking, and she stopped beside him. The water lay completely still, and the late morning light came through the trees in long, quiet pieces that moved slightly with the wind. "I want to tell you something about myself," he said. "Something I do not say often. Tell me. I was engaged 3 years ago." He looked at the water rather than at her. "She was someone my parents approved of, someone from a family they respected. I convinced myself the practical alignment was enough, that what I was feeling was a reasonable version of what I was supposed to feel." He paused. "I was wrong about that. I understood it too late." She had been more interested in what the name could provide than in anything specifically about me. "When I finally saw it clearly, I ended it. My parents were relieved. He stopped. "I was more hurt than I expected. Not about her, about myself. About the fact that I had looked at someone closely and still seen the wrong thing." Nadia was very quiet. "And then your parents arranged the interviews," she said softly, "because they were worried about me, and it was the tool they knew how to use. You keep saying that about people who have hurt you. Meaning well is real, even when it produces the wrong result. I would rather believe people mean well and be occasionally wrong than assume the alternative." He held her gaze. "That is something my mother taught me. It is one of the better things she gave me." Nadia looked out at the still water, feeling something in her chest that she could no longer organize away. "I should tell you something in return," she said. "You do not have to. I want to." She pulled her coat a little closer against the morning air. "I am not easy to be with. Not because I am unkind, because I have opinions I do not hide, and standards I do not lower, and I have been told more than once by men who should have known better that I am intimidating." She paused. "I am not intimidating. I am simply unwilling to be smaller than I am for someone else's comfort. And that has cost me more than one relationship." Woo-suk looked at her for a long, careful moment. "I know," he said. "You say that like you have been paying attention. I have been paying attention since you walked back into that elevator and told Kong 15 minutes. He looked at her directly. "A woman who knows exactly who she is and refuses to pretend otherwise is not intimidating. She is the rarest thing in most rooms." He paused. "I have not been especially good at recognizing rare things in my own life. I am trying to be better at it." The garden was very quiet around them. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, and the sound moved through the trees and dissolved into the morning air. Nadia looked at this man standing beside still water, telling her true things in a careful voice, and understood with a strange, settled certainty that she was in significant and irreversible trouble. "This is going to be complicated," she said. "Yes, your family, my career, the professional relationship, yes to all of that." She looked at him. "What if your parents do not come fully around?" He looked at her without hesitation. "Then that will be hard, and I will handle it. But I will not make a decision about my life based on what I am afraid of. I did that once. I know exactly what it costs." She held his gaze. "You are going to have to be patient with me. I do not move fast when something matters." "I know," he said. "You left the building. I came back. You came back." Something shifted in his expression, quiet and complete. "That is the part I have not stopped thinking about." She looked at him a moment longer, then looked back at the water, then started walking again, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked the rest of the garden in the kind of quiet that is not empty at all, but completely full of something neither of them had said out loud yet. The relationship did not move fast. It moved the way things move when both people have been careful before and understand exactly what carelessness costs. They had dinner in New York, sometimes in Chicago when his work brought him through. They talked late into the night about things that had nothing to do with work. Small, honest things. His habit of reading history books at midnight because his brain would not settle otherwise. Her habit of cooking elaborate Sunday meals for one, because her grandmother had taught her that feeding yourself well was its own quiet form of self-respect. He met Rochelle over a video call that Nadia had not staged or prepared him for, and he sat through her sister's rapid, sharp, entirely unapologetic questioning with a calm good humor that earned him immediate and lasting approval. "He is solid," Rochelle told Nadia afterward, "not performing it, actually solid." That, from Rochelle, meant more than most people understood. Mean, occasionally, always briefly, always underneath it the particular warmth of a woman who had already made her decision about someone and was simply maintaining the relationship she had chosen to have. Dioksu, when Nadia came to New York, for what were still nominally business visits, began insisting she stay for dinner every time. He asked about her cases with sharp, genuine curiosity, and listened to her answers with the full attention of a man who respected intelligence above nearly everything else. 2 months in, Subin called her directly. "Lunch," Subin said. "Just us." "Is that strange?" Nadia said. "A little. Yes, but also yes to lunch." They met at a quiet restaurant in Midtown. Subin arrived straight from a shift, still in scrubs beneath her coat, carrying the direct energy of a woman who allocated her limited off-duty hours with surgical precision. "I want to tell you something about my brother," Subin said, once they had ordered. "Your family does this," Nadia said. "You take turns calling me separately." "We are a coordinated family," Subin said, entirely unashamed. "What I want to tell you is this." After his engagement ended, Woo-suk went quiet in a way that was different from his normal quiet. He kept working. He kept performing every responsibility perfectly. But something in him was dimmed, turned down partway. She picked up her water glass. "When he called me the day you left the building, he was frustrated about the whole process. But underneath the frustration, he was the most present I had heard him in 3 years. He did not know I could hear it. He was complaining, but he was alive in a way he had not been." She set the glass down. "I am not telling you what to do. I am telling you he is worth the complication, in case that information matters to you." Nadia looked at this woman who had come to a post-shift lunch specifically to say one honest thing about her brother. "It matters," she said. Subin nodded once and picked her menu back up, and they talked about other things, and it was the quiet beginning of a friendship neither of them had anticipated, and both of them would come to genuinely value. 3 months in, on a quiet Sunday evening in Nadia's Chicago apartment, with takeout going cold on the coffee table and neither of them actually watching whatever was playing on the television, something shifted into the open. They had been talking for an hour about something that had started as a news story and slowly turned into a real conversation about justice and whether institutions could actually change or whether they simply recycled their old failures in newer language. It was the kind of conversation Nadia could not remember having with anyone besides Rochelle, the kind that made her feel like her whole mind was finally being used. Then, the conversation went quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives once everything that needed saying has settled, and something else, something that is not made of words, has entered the room instead. Woo-suk was looking at her. She looked back. "I need to tell you something," he said. "You always need to tell me something," she said. "It is my favorite thing about you." Something moved across his face at that. "I am in love with you," he said. Steady, direct, completely undefended. "I have been for a while. I did not say it because I was trying to move at the pace that was right for you. But if I do not say it now, I think it is going to become the largest thing in this room anyway, and I would rather it be a thing I said than a thing that just sat here between us." The apartment was very quiet. Nadia looked at his face, more open than she had ever seen it, the careful stillness completely gone, and what remained underneath it was clear and real and directed entirely at her. "Woo-suk," she said. "Yes. I walked back into that elevator on purpose," she said. "Not because of the meeting, because I needed to know what kind of person sends someone to bring a woman back after she has already walked out. I needed to understand who that person was." She held his gaze. "Everything since then has been me finding out, and everything I have found out has made one answer clearer." He waited, very still. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to be rational about it for 2 months, and I am completely done trying." He reached across the space between them and took her hand in both of his and held it and said nothing for a long moment. And in that silence was everything that did not need words. "My parents are going to be extraordinarily pleased with themselves," he said finally. Nadia laughed, a real laugh from somewhere deep. "Your mother has been pleased with herself since the day I walked back into the building. She told me so on the phone." "Of course she did," he said, and he was smiling in the full, unguarded way she had started collecting like something precious every single time it appeared. The months that followed were, by both their private accounts, the best either of them could remember. They stopped pretending the New York visits were primarily professional. He came to Chicago on weekends when he could manage it, and they cooked together in her kitchen, badly in his case and beautifully in hers, and he sat on the counter and watched her work, and she let him because she had decided somewhere along the way that being watched by someone who genuinely saw her was not a vulnerability, but a gift she had simply never been offered before. She met his college friends at a loud, warm dinner in Brooklyn that ran 3 hours past when it was supposed to end. His friends looked at her across the table with the particular expression of people who had spent years quietly hoping their friend would find the right person, and were now visibly thrilled to discover they had been right to hope. One of them, a man named Jinho, who had known Woo-suk since they were 19, leaned over at one point and said, low enough that only she could hear, "He used to talk about work the entire dinner, every dinner, for years. Tonight he has mentioned work exactly once." He raised his glass slightly. "I do not know what you did, but do not stop doing it." She met Rochelle in person shortly after, in Chicago, an event Nadia observed with real nervousness and which resolved itself within 20 minutes when Rochelle simply asked Woo-suk directly and without preamble what his intentions were. He answered her seriously and honestly, without deflecting into humor the way most people did when Rochelle came at them like that, and Rochelle looked at him for a long moment, then looked at Nadia, and gave a single decisive nod that meant, in the shorthand the two sisters had shared their entire lives, this one. They argued twice during those months, real arguments, not performances staged for an audience that did not exist. Once about a decision he had made regarding a Yun Global contract without consulting her professional opinion first, which she pointed out was both a business error and, separately, a personal one, given everything that had passed between them by that point. He listened. He did not get defensive, and he did not retreat into the particular silence some men use as a shield. He acknowledged she was right, and he did not make the same error again. The second argument took longer to resolve. It was about the pace of certain conversations regarding the future, conversations where she needed him to understand clearly that her independence was not a wall she was building against him, but something she intended to bring into the relationship with her rather than surrender at the door. That one took real time. They sat with it. They talked through it past midnight, past the point where either of them wanted to keep talking, because they had both learned separately, in earlier relationships that had not survived exactly this kind of pressure, that avoiding the hard conversation only delayed the damage. They came out the other side of it knowing each other in a way that only real disagreement, handled honestly and without cruelty, can ever actually produce. Somewhere in the middle of those months, Nadia finally had the conversation she had promised herself, back on that first strange afternoon, that she would eventually have. She called her senior partner into her office on a Thursday and closed the door and told him plainly that sending her into a marriage interview without warning her of its true nature had been a serious misjudgment, regardless of how it happened to turn out. He had the good sense not to defend himself with anything except an honest apology, and admitted he had genuinely believed he was doing her a kindness rather than putting her in an impossible position without her consent. She accepted the apology and told him, in the same even tone she used for closing arguments, that if he ever did anything like it again, on her behalf or anyone else's, she would not be nearly as forgiving a second time. He never did. Years later he would tell colleagues, only half joking, that Nadia Abrams was the one person at the firm he was more afraid of than any judge he had ever appeared before, and he meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. The pressure, when it came, arrived from an unexpected direction. A financial gossip site ran a short item 8 months into the relationship, built entirely on speculation, naming Wusuk and describing Nadia only as an unidentified American attorney linked to the Yun family, alongside a blurry photograph of the two of them leaving a restaurant. The item was small, poorly sourced, and gone from most feeds within a day, but it landed hard anyway, because it was the first time either of them had been forced to see their private life described in language that belonged to strangers. Nadia read it twice at her desk in Chicago and felt something cold move through her that she recognized, uncomfortably, as fear, not of the attention itself, but of what it might mean to permanently exist inside a family whose every private moment carried public weight. She called him that night and told him honestly what she was feeling. "I did not sign up to be a headline," she said. "I do not know how to do that and still feel like myself." He listened without interrupting, which by then she had come to expect from him and had stopped taking for granted. "You are not going to become a headline," he said finally. "You are going to occasionally be near one, and I will do everything in my power to keep the distance as wide as I can manage. But I cannot promise you it will never happen again, because it will. What I can promise is that I will never ask you to change who you are to make it easier for anyone else to look at us." He paused. "If that is not enough, tell me now, and I will understand completely, and I will not make it harder than it already is." She sat with that for a long moment, the phone warm against her ear, and understood that this, too, was a version of the same choice she had made walking back into that elevator 8 months earlier, whether to stay in a room that had shown her something uncomfortable, or to leave because staying required more courage than she had originally planned on spending. "It is enough," she said finally. "I just needed to say it out loud to you instead of carrying it by myself." "Always say it out loud to me," he said. "That is the whole point of this." The story faded within a week, as small stories do, and no other outlet picked it up, largely because Deoksu quietly made 2 phone calls that Nadia only learned about much later, and chose, after some consideration, not to be bothered by. But the conversation itself did not fade nearly as quickly, and it became, in its own way, one of the more important ones they had, because it forced both of them to say plainly what they were and were not willing to sacrifice for each other, and to discover, with real relief, that the answers on both sides were the same. Myungja noticed the change the next time Nadia came to New York for what was technically a business visit, but was really by then simply a reason to be in the same city as him. The older woman pulled her aside in the kitchen before dinner and looked at her with those quiet eyes that missed nothing. "You are happy," Myungja said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Nadia said. Myungja nodded once, satisfied, and turned back to the stove. Without turning around again, she said, "My son has not looked like himself in a long time. He looks like himself now." A pause. "That is because of you." Nadia stood in the kitchen and felt something move through her, too large and too complete to fit into a single sentence. So she simply said, "He makes it easy." Myungja made a sound that was unmistakably a grandmother's sound of approval, even though she was not one yet. "Good," she said. "Set the table." Nadia set the table. It was a Tuesday morning in April, 7 months after the Brooklyn Garden, when it happened. They were in Central Park, his idea, which she had questioned at first because it was a Tuesday, and they both had work waiting for them, but he had been quietly insistent in the particular way he had when he had already decided something and was simply managing the timing carefully around it. The park was not crowded on a weekday morning. The light had that specific New York gold that April finally commits to once the season has settled in for good, and the trees were doing something extraordinary with it, scattering it across the path in moving pieces. They had been walking for about 20 minutes near the water when he stopped. She stopped beside him. She looked at him and understood immediately that something was about to happen, because the careful stillness he wore like a second skin was completely gone, and he looked more exposed than she had ever seen him, and more certain, at exactly the same time. He turned to face her fully. "You walked back into that elevator," he said, "and then you walked into that room and told my parents exactly who you were, without softening a single edge of it. And then every day since, you have been exactly who you are, completely, without apology. That is the most extraordinary thing I have ever watched anyone do." He reached into his jacket pocket. "I had a very precise speech prepared. I worked on it for 2 weeks. What happened to it?" "You happened to it," he said. "You make precision difficult. I cannot be in the same space as you and be anything other than completely honest." He opened the small box in his hand. The ring inside was simple and extraordinary at once. A deep burgundy stone set into a clean gold band, the exact kind of thing she would have chosen for herself if she had ever let herself imagine choosing. "I am in love with you. I want to spend the rest of my life being honest with you. Will you marry me?" Nadia looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She thought about an elevator she had almost not walked back into. About 15 minutes, and a cup of coffee made exactly right without asking. About a conference room and 2 inches of space neither of them had needed to close. About a garden and 100 Sunday evenings, and every real argument and every real laugh, and all the small, true things they had said to each other across the quiet, ordinary months in between. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it there, and then she looked at him, and he was smiling in the full, completely open way she had been quietly storing up like something irreplaceable every single time she was lucky enough to see it. She put her hand against the side of his face, and he covered it with his own, and they stood like that in the April light on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and it was simple and complete and entirely right. Her phone rang 40 seconds later. She looked at the screen. "Rochelle," she said. Woo-suk laughed. "How does she already know?" "I do not know," Nadia said. "She always knows." She answered it. "Rochelle, is it?" "Yes," Rochelle said at full volume, before Nadia had said a single word. "It is yes." The sound that came through the phone was not describable in reasonable language, they told his family that evening. Deoksu and Myungja were already in the sitting room of the townhouse. Subin and Patrick had been asked to come for dinner with no explanation given, and Woo-suk had simply texted, "family dinner," and Subin, who knew her brother thoroughly, had texted Nadia separately at 2 in the afternoon, "Should I bring good wine?" Nadia had replied, "Bring the best one you have." Subin arrived with 2 bottles. They were all seated at the table, the food barely served, when Woo-suk looked at his father and said simply, "I asked Nadia to marry me this morning." The table went completely still. Nadia watched it happen. Deok-su looked at his son, then at Nadia, then back at his son's face, open and certain in a way that Deok-su, who had known that face for 36 years, clearly recognized as something he had not seen in a very long time, something full, something right. The old man's composure held for approximately 4 seconds. Then he pressed his hand flat against the table and made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else, but lived somewhere between them. The sound of a man who has spent a long time hoping for something and has just watched it finally arrive. Myungja did not try to hold anything back. She rose from her chair, came around the table, and took Nadia's face gently in both her hands, looking at her with those quiet eyes that had seen her clearly from the very first afternoon. "I knew," Myungja said, "from the moment you walked back through that door." "You kept saying that," Nadia said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "Because it kept being true." Myungja pressed her forehead briefly and gently to Nadia's, a gesture so warm and complete that Nadia felt it move all the way through her. Then she straightened, wiped her own eyes without embarrassment, and returned to her seat with the dignity of a woman who cries when something is worth crying over and is not sorry for it. Subin stood and came directly to Nadia and hugged her without a word, held on a long moment, then pulled back and looked at the ring with open satisfaction. "The stone is burgundy," she said. "It is," Nadia confirmed. Subin looked at her brother. "You paid attention." "I paid attention," he said. Patrick stood and shook Woo-suk's hand warmly, then turned to Nadia and said, with more words than she had heard him string together across their entire collective history of dinners, "He is a good man. You are a remarkable woman. This is exactly right." Then he sat back down, contribution made, position clear, and quietly returned to his plate. Deoksu had recovered himself by then. He reached across the corner of the table and took Nadia's hand in his old firm grip and held it a moment. "My wife was right about you," he said. "She is almost always right. I have learned to accept this." Myungja gave her husband a look. "Almost always," Deoksu amended, with the particular dry delivery of a man who had been happily married for 45 years and had long ago made peace with losing that particular argument. The table laughed together, all of them, the sound filling the townhouse dining room and drifting out into the evening beyond the tall windows. Nadia sat in the middle of it. This family that had begun as a stranger's carefully arranged interview and had somehow become something she had not known she was missing, and felt Woo-suk's hand find hers under the table, holding it with the same steadiness she had come to understand was simply, fundamentally, who he was. She looked at the ring on her hand. She thought about an elevator, a lobby button, a car she had asked for and never taken. She thought about everything that had almost never happened because she had almost stayed gone. "Thank you," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. "For what?" "For coming back." She looked at him a long moment, at this man who had told her true things from the very first minute, who had pushed back against his own family for her sake, who had stood beside Stillwater and said honest things that clearly cost him, who had put a burgundy stone on her finger because he had, in fact, been paying attention the entire time. "Thank you," she said, "for sending someone to ask." They were married the following October, a year and a half after a stranger's audition had gone spectacularly wrong in exactly the right direction. The wedding was held at the same Upper East Side townhouse, the ballroom transformed for the occasion with white orchids arranged in vases spaced along every wall, an intentional echo neither of them had to explain to anyone who had heard the full story by then. Myungja had insisted on the orchids herself. Some things deserve to be reclaimed, she told Nadia while they stood together in the dressing room an hour before the ceremony, adjusting a veil that had belonged to Myungja's own mother. That hallway gave you nothing but an audition. This room is going to give you the rest of your life. Rochelle stood beside her as maid of honor, radiant and uncharacteristically emotional, having spent the better part of the morning insisting she was absolutely not going to cry, and then crying anyway the moment the string quartet began. Subin stood on the other side, having claimed the role of unofficial second sister months earlier and never once relinquished it. When Deok-soo walked Nadia down the aisle, a role she had asked him to fill after her own father had passed years before, he held her arm the entire way with the careful, deliberate steadiness of a man determined not to let his composure slip a second time in front of witnesses, and mostly succeeded, and did not entirely succeed, and nobody in the room held it against him. Woo-suk cried openly when she reached him, without the faintest attempt to manage it, and it was the last piece of evidence anyone in that room needed that the careful stillness he had worn like armor the first day she met him had been fully, permanently retired. At the reception, Rochelle gave a toast that started as a joke about the burgundy dress and ended, without her fully intending it to, with her voice breaking. "My sister has spent her entire life refusing to be smaller than she is for anyone's comfort," she said, glass raised, looking directly at Nadia. "I watched men leave rooms because they could not handle that. I watched her decide over and over that she would rather be alone than be diminished." She looked at Woo-suk, and then this one sent someone after her, not to change her mind, to ask her to come back exactly as she was. She lifted her glass higher, to the man who understood that the right answer was never to make her smaller, it was to build a room big enough for all of her. The whole ballroom rose to that, glasses lifted, and Nadia, who had promised herself weeks earlier that she would not cry at her own wedding, cried anyway, and did not mind losing that particular argument at all. Later that night, after the guests had thinned and the band had slowed into something quieter, Myungja found her once more near the same wall of orchids and took both her hands. "I told you once that I decide about people quickly when it matters," she said. "I want you to know I decided something else tonight. Watching you dance with my son, I decided you did not marry into this family. You completed it." Nadia held on to that sentence for the rest of her life, the way people hold on to the handful of things someone says to them that arrive exactly when they are needed and never quite stop being true afterward. A year after the wedding, Nadia stood in the kitchen of the Chicago apartment they still kept, alongside the New York residence that had slowly, unhurriedly become their primary home, and looked out the window at a late spring evening while a pot of her grandmother's recipe simmered on the stove. Woo-suk was traveling less by then, having restructured the American division so it no longer required his constant physical presence in 3 cities at once, a decision his father had initially resisted and then, after watching his son's life visibly widen because of it, had fully and enthusiastically supported. Nadia had left her old firm 18 months earlier and opened her own practice, a small, deliberately selective firm that took on exactly the kind of complicated cross-border corporate work she had once solved for Yun Global in 11 days, work that let her keep the sharp, exacting parts of herself that had first caught Deok-soo's attention across a boardroom table and had never once needed to be softened for anyone's comfort. Subin had become, by then, less a sister-in-law than simply a sister, the kind who called without warning to complain about a resident and ended every call the same way, checking in on you, not the marriage, you specifically. Rochelle and Myungja had, somewhat improbably, become close in their own right, exchanging recipes across an ocean of cultural difference that neither of them treated as a barrier so much as an invitation, and Nadia had walked into her mother-in-law's kitchen more than once to find the two of them deep in an argument about seasoning that clearly delighted them both. Deoksu had, true to his word, learned to accept that his wife was almost always right, and had taken to introducing Nadia at company events not as his son's wife but, pointedly, as the attorney who solved what 3 other firms could not, a distinction he made a point of repeating whenever anyone underestimated her, which by that point in her career happened rarely and never twice. On the anniversary of the day she had walked back into that elevator, Woo-suk brought her coffee in bed before either of them had to be anywhere, oat milk, 1 sugar, exactly right, the way he always made it now without needing to guess. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her for a long moment, the same way he had looked at her across a cleared hallway a year and a half earlier, uncertain and completely undefended, except now there was nothing uncertain left in it at all. 15 minutes, he said. She looked at him. What? That is all it took. 15 minutes, and I have spent every day since trying to be worth the fact that you came back for them. She took the coffee from his hands and set it on the nightstand and pulled him down beside her in the quiet gold light of an ordinary Tuesday morning, and did not answer him in words, because some things did not need them, not anymore, not between the two of them, not after everything that had already been said. If this story moved something in you, tell us in the comments which moment landed hardest. Was it the elevator, the garden by the still water, the proposal in the April light, or Myungja pressing her forehead gently to Nadia's and telling her she had known from the very first day? We read every single one, and we genuinely want to hear which part found you. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded today that the right people do not ask you to become smaller to be chosen. They come running after the version of you that walked away. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now, because every week we bring you another story exactly like this one. The lesson this story carries is simple, and it is permanent. The woman who refused to perform for anyone's approval did not lose the room she wanted, not through strategy, but through the plain, unapologetic act of being completely herself. The man who found the courage to dismantle what his family had arranged so that something real could finally breathe did not lose his family's love in the process. He deepened it beyond anything an arranged interview could ever have produced. Know your worth before anyone else has the chance to name it for you. That is not arrogance. That is the ground everything real gets built on, and it is the only ground strong enough to hold a love that lasts.